In the spring of 2008, Austria was confronted with a horrifying secret. A woman and her children were found locked away in the basement of an apartment building for decades. Behind a closed door lay a life of violence and pain, perpetrated by their father, who had turned the house into a prison. Josef Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, Austria. He spent his childhood as the country reeled from the aftermath of World War II. His family relationships were complex. His mother raised him with strictness, and his father soon abandoned the family. This paved the way for Josef's character to develop rigidity, a desire for control, and secrecy. From an early age, he showed an interest in technology and construction. After receiving an engineering degree, Fritzl began working as an electrician and construction worker. He was practical and hardworking, but also reserved and demanding. Outwardly, he was an ordinary small-town resident, unremarkable among his neighbors. In 1956, Josef married Rosemary. She was younger than him and perceived her husband as an authoritative and strict man. Their family life seemed prosperous. They bought a house and had 7 children. However, the family atmosphere was far from harmonious. Fritzl demonstrated an authoritarian style, making all decisions single-handedly and demanding obedience. Neighbors described him as a stern but efficient man. He cared for the appearance of his home, kept it tidy, and loved to show off his wealth. This outward respectability concealed something else: complete dominance over his loved ones and a lack of emotional intimacy. Even earlier in his life, Fritzl came to the attention of the police. In 1967, he was convicted of a sexual crime against a woman and sentenced to prison. This fact was subsequently known to few, as he tried to carefully conceal his past. After his release, he returned to his family and continued his normal life as if nothing had happened. Rosemary, his wife, took care of the house and children, completely subordinating herself to her husband. She did not interfere with his decisions and accepted all the rules he set. The children grew up under constant supervision. Among them was Elizabeth, born in 1966. She would later become the central figure in the tragic story. By adolescence, Elizabeth tried to resist her father's control, which led to conflicts. She wanted more freedom and dreamed of a life outside the home. Fritzl perceived this as a threat to his power and increasingly restricted her opportunities. At the same time, Josef showed interest in building additional spaces in the house. In the late 1970s, he began work on the basement, citing the need to expand utility space. None of his neighbors were surprised by his passion for construction. He often engaged in such projects. However, it was then that he conceived the idea of using the new premises for a criminal plot. By the mid-1980s, Fritzl's family appeared outwardly normal: a wife, several children, a house, and a working father. But internally, tensions were growing, rooted in authoritarianism and strict control. This was especially true for Elizabeth, with whom the relationship became increasingly strained. By this time, Josef had already formulated a clear plan. He wanted to create an isolated space where no one could enter without his knowledge. To this end, he began designing a specially constructed basement, equipped with hidden doors and additional security layers. On the surface, it looked like just another technical hobby. In reality, however, he was laying the foundation for a crime that would later shock the world. Thus, the first chapter of Fritzl's life is the story of a man who skillfully combined outward respectability with inner cruelty. His family became an object of control, and his home became a symbol of power and a pretext for a long-term criminal plan. In the second half of the 1970s, Josef Fritzl began implementing his plan. The house in Amstetten already had a basement, but its size and layout were inadequate. He began systematically expanding the space, creating a network of corridors and rooms. Officially, he explained this as the need to equip storage space and a workshop. To neighbors and acquaintances, this seemed entirely plausible. Fritzl had always been involved in construction work and was skilled at it himself. The work continued over several years. He reinforced the walls with concrete blocks and installed additional layers of insulation on the ceilings and floors. He He paid special attention to soundproofing. Not a single sound was to escape. The doors were reinforced with metal frames, and the locks were installed so that they could not be opened from the inside. One of these doors was later concealed behind a shelving unit, making it invisible to outsiders. Electricity and ventilation were installed secretly. Fritzl used his electrical experience to install lighting and ensure air circulation. He understood that prolonged underground stays would require a constant supply of oxygen, so he installed a ventilation system with filters. However, it was intermittent, which would lead to constant stuffiness and illness among the prisoners. The basement gradually transformed into an isolated space with just a few rooms. It contained a small kitchen, a shower, a toilet, and sleeping quarters. The space remained extremely cramped, the ceilings low, and the conditions Spartan. But for Fritzl, this was enough. He was creating a place where he could completely control the lives of others. At the same time, he carefully concealed his activities from his family. He told his wife and children that he was working on improving the house and outbuildings. Rosemary didn't ask unnecessary questions. She was accustomed to her husband's reserved nature and didn't interfere with his projects. The neighbors only noticed that he was constantly building and renovating. By the mid-1980s, the basement had acquired its finished appearance. Entry was only possible through a heavy armored door controlled by an electric lock. Only one person knew the code, Fritzl himself. No one else in the family had access to this room. During this period, tensions in his relationship with Elizabeth increased. She became a teenager, increasingly striving for independence. Her father perceived her attempts to escape control as a personal insult. Conflicts became increasingly frequent, and Elizabeth's attempts to run away from home only strengthened his resolve to isolate his daughter forever. By the end of the decade, Fritzl had a meticulously crafted plan. The basement became the instrument for his plan. There was enough space to hold someone for extended periods, and security measures eliminated the possibility of escape. Outwardly, the family still appeared ordinary. None of their neighbors or acquaintances suspected that a secret prison had been established right beneath the house. Thus, building the basement wasn't just a construction project. It was deliberate preparation for the crime he planned to commit against his own daughter. On August 28, 1984, Elizabeth Fritzl turned 18. She had already tried to run away from home several times, but was always returned. Joseph perceived his daughter's behavior as a threat to his authority. It was during this period that he finally decided to carry out his plan and isolate her. On the day of the abduction, he asked Elizabeth to help him with work in the basement. She agreed, unaware that a premeditated trap lay behind it. When they went downstairs, Fritzl led her into one of the new rooms. There, he quickly incapacitated her with a narcotic and locked her behind a massive door. From that moment on, her life of complete isolation began. In the first few days, Elizabeth was in a state of shock. She didn't understand what was happening or why her father had done it. He explained that she would now live here in specially created rooms. Her protests, pleas, and tears were of no consequence. Fritzl immediately made it clear that he was in complete control of the situation, and resistance would only lead to punishment. Outwardly, he continued to lead a normal life. To his wife and neighbors, he claimed Elizabeth had run away from home and joined a cult. Later, he even forged a letter supposedly from her, in which she wrote that she didn't want to return. He showed these papers to the police and relatives to explain her disappearance. Thus, the official version became established. Elizabeth had left voluntarily. Meanwhile, a strict order was established in the basement. The lights were turned on and off at Fritzl's discretion. He brought food and water himself, communicating with his daughter through a small opening or in person. He often provided food in limited quantities to emphasize his authority. Over time, living conditions in the basement became a little more comfortable. Joseph brought in old furniture, household items, and sometimes books. But none of this compensated for the main thing, the complete lack of freedom. The basement remained damp, cramped, and stuffy. The ventilation was intermittent, and the space was so confined that Elizabeth couldn't even walk properly from room to room. After several months, it became clear that the confinement was long-term. Fritzl regularly visited the basement and emphasized that there was no escape. His main goal was not only to deprive his daughter of her freedom, but also to completely subjugate her. He forced her to follow his orders and demanded obedience. By 1986, Elizabeth's life had completely transformed into an underground existence. She lived by the rules her father set. To the outside world, she remained missing, but for her family and neighbors, her absence ceased to be a mystery after the appearance of a forged letter. The police officially closed the disappearance case, believing the theory that she had left voluntarily. It was during this period that a new, more difficult phase of her imprisonment began. Elizabeth was completely isolated from society, had no contact with the outside world, and depended on Fritzl for everything: food, water, light, and even air. He controlled her every minute. Despite the harsh conditions, she tried to adapt. She wrote notes, took care of small tasks, and tried to maintain her inner strength. But as the years passed, the basement became her only reality. For Fritzl, this was a period of consolidating his power. He had achieved his main goal. The basement had fulfilled its purpose. Outside, he continued to live as a respectable citizen, but inside, he had created a hidden prison that no one suspected existed. In the late 1980s, Elizabeth's life in the basement changed even further. Joseph Fritzl's control and isolation were no longer limited. Amidst the constant violence, children began to appear. Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children, but the conditions in which she gave birth and raised them were extremely harsh. Elizabeth's first child was born in the late 1980s. It was a trial for her, forced to endure in complete isolation, without medical care or support. Joseph provided her with only the bare essentials: old medical literature and a set of instruments. All births took place naturally, in a damp, cramped space. Over time, the number of children increased. Some grew up with their mother in the basement, while others ended up on the surface. To this end, Fritzl devised a special scheme. He would drop off infants on the doorstep of the house, leaving notes in Elizabeth's name. These messages allegedly explained that she was unable to care for the child and asked her parents to take him in. Rosemary, Joseph's wife, took in these children and raised them as her grandchildren. Thus, a strange situation developed in the home. Some of the children were officially listed as foundlings, but no one questioned why they were appearing in the Fritzl family. Child protection authorities occasionally inquired about the circumstances, but contented themselves with the explanation that the mother left the child voluntarily. Joseph skillfully supported this theory, and no suspicions arose. The children who remained with Elizabeth in the basement grew up in extremely cramped conditions. The space was limited to a few rooms with low ceilings. There was no natural light, only lamps. The ventilation was intermittent, making the air heavy. The children suffered from vitamin deficiencies, constant illnesses, and lack of exercise. Elizabeth tried to care for them as best she could. She taught them to read and write, told them stories, and tried to create some semblance of a normal life. However, the situation remained unbearable. The noise of the street was barely audible through the concrete walls, and the children had no idea that there was a world beyond the basement. Fritzl established a strict routine. He showed up daily, bringing food and water, and sometimes clothing. These visits were always punctuated by reminders that escape was impossible. He convinced Elizabeth and the children that the basement was wired with an alarm system. If they attempted to escape, the entire room would be filled with gas. These threats created an atmosphere of fear and deprived them of hope. Meanwhile, above ground, he continued to play the role of a caring grandfather. The children he dropped off, went to school, received documents, and were considered ordinary members of society. No one suspected that their brothers and sisters remained underground. By the mid-1990s, an entire family was living in the basement. Conditions worsened. There wasn't enough space, food was delivered irregularly, and illnesses were piling up. It was especially hard on the younger children, who never saw daylight. Despite this, Fritzl's system continued to operate. From the outside, the house looked like an ordinary home for an elderly couple. Inside, however, 2 parallel worlds existed. The official family with their grandchildren and a hidden group of prisoners, completely dependent on one man. So the years passed. Elizabeth grew increasingly exhausted, but continued to fight for her children's survival. Every day in the basement was like the last, and time became an endless series of identical days. Fritzl, meanwhile, reinforced his sense of control. He managed to create an illusion for the outside world, concealing the truth even from his closest relatives. For 2 decades, no one realized that people deprived of their freedom lived right beneath the house. By the 2000s, life in the basement had reached its limits. Children raised in isolation suffered from chronic illnesses related to the lack of sunlight and fresh air. The condition of Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Kirsten, born in 1989, was the most severe. By the age of 19, she suffered from severe health problems, vitamin deficiencies, immune system problems, and exhaustion. In the spring of 2008, her illness worsened to a critical level. On April 16, 2008, Kirsten lost consciousness. Elizabeth begged her father to let her take her to the hospital. The situation was life-threatening, and for the first time in decades, Joseph relented. He carried his daughter out of the basement and took her to the local clinic in Amstetten. However, doctors immediately noticed the patient's unusual condition: malnutrition, no medical history, and rare illnesses typical of people who have never seen the light of day. The doctors began asking questions. Fritzl presented the theory that Kirsten was a granddaughter, abandoned to him by his daughter, Elizabeth, who allegedly lived in a sect and was unable to care for the child. But the doctors insisted on meeting with the mother, as her testimony was necessary for a diagnosis. At this point, tension in the basement increased. Elizabeth understood this was her only chance for salvation. She convinced her father to let her visit his daughter in the hospital. Joseph, hoping to confirm his story, agreed. On April 26, 2008, Elizabeth and her 2 children left the basement for the first time in 24 years. When they arrived at the clinic, doctors and police immediately noticed inconsistencies in their stories. Elizabeth was under severe stress, but soon, having received guarantees of safety, she decided to tell the truth. On the night of April 27th, she gave the police a detailed statement. She described the kidnapping, the basement, the years of isolation, and the birth of 7 children. The next day, police arrived at Fritzl's home. They searched the basement and discovered hidden rooms with low ceilings, concrete walls, and heavy doors. The living conditions were shockingly harsh: sleeping quarters on old mattresses, a makeshift kitchen, and evidence of children's constant presence. Everything corroborated Elizabeth's testimony. Joseph was arrested that very day. During interrogation, he initially tried to deny the charges, but under pressure from evidence and testimony, he confessed. The story soon became known to the world. Austria and the entire world were shocked by the scale of the crime. For nearly a quarter of a century, the family had lived in isolation right in the center of a small town. The public reaction was immediate. The media covered every detail of the investigation, publishing photographs of the house and comments from neighbors who couldn't believe such a secret was hiding in their quiet neighborhood. Doctors reported severe health consequences for the children: poor vision, mental disorders, and social maladjustment. In March 2009, Fritzl's trial took place. He was charged with kidnapping, rape, and murder of a newborn child. One of the infants died in the basement shortly after birth, as well as imprisonment. The court found him guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh: life imprisonment in a maximum security prison. After her release, Elizabeth and her children received medical care and psychological support. They were given separate, secure housing to protect them from media pressure and public scrutiny. The case itself went down in forensic history as one of the most horrific examples of violence and a decades-long cover-up of a crime in Europe. The story ended with the perpetrator's arrest, but the consequences for the victims remained deeply traumatic. Life in the basement continued for over 2 decades, and its destructive impact was felt long after their release. The case of Joseph Fritzl became a symbol of monstrous violence and the decades-long cover-up of crimes. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, and Elizabeth and her children began a new life under state protection. This case went down in history as one of the most shocking in Europe, revealing the scale of the hidden horror behind the facade of an ordinary home.